kindred voices, they waken my spirit. These words they repeat in sweet accents of love. Be true to your trust, or you cannot inherit.
You are standing at the entrance to the Shaker Cemetery. Used since the early years of Harvard Shaker Village, the cemetery contains about 330 graves. The cemetery reflects the hierarchy of the village and is a way of understanding village demographics.
There is an organization to the burial placement in the cemetery. In the early years, there was a selection made to bury in two different parts, and basically the church family was buried in one side, and the 5 rows to one side of this promenade that separates the cemetery, and all the other families, north, south, and east, on the other side. And then within those 2 areas, there are 2 brother rows and 3 sister rows. So on each side of the cemetery. And they're all in chronological sequence. I mean, there was nothing random about it. The pattern is not visible unless you separate the burials by date, because in the early years, it hadn't become a standard. So that we're talking about between 1791 and 1819. And then when there was a shortage of space, the pattern began to disintegrate because the sisters entered the brother rows, which happened around the 1870s. The church family is non-biological too, got to remember that, was where the most devoted members of the community lived. The north, south, and east were clusters of places where people lived that weren't quite as devoted or pure. It's sometimes good to look at the families as orders in themselves. You know, the South was a gathering family. This is where new people went. The second family was second to the church. That was the North family. But it's sort of like an order. And the East was really technically not a family at all, because their leadership was the same as the South.
Families come about for a couple of different reasons. When Father Joseph was given the vision of church order, he only envisioned this inner court, and it really evolves out of the interpretation of the ancient court of the Jews. And so there was the 3 courts. There was the outer court where Gentiles could be, there was the middle court where women could be, and there was the inner court where only men and God could be. And so he saw that as the progression of the church itself. So church order was the innermost court. And that was primarily, in his initial vision, was just supposed to be made up of virgins and children, young people who could be brought up in the faith. They would know nothing unclean. And it didn't play out in its fullness outside of New Lebanon, New York. But what it transferred to them was the people who were the most solid, those who were gathered in to begin with. And they would constitute what were called the church order. And every family within a village was generally named in its positional point from the church. That's where the meeting house was, etc., etc. Now, oftentimes they had too many people to just be able to construct buildings and all of that to house all of these people. So they would break them up. And it meant there could be more than one church family, as it were, in a community. Often they were called the second order or the second family. And then you have the gathering orders. Harvard tended to have very small families, which were much more manageable. And I think that always works better. I think when you start getting too many people in a community, it's too hard to keep them together.
The cast iron lollipop markers give the cemetery a distinctive look. Originally, they used slate markers, and then they were converted to this type.
The cemetery in Harvard was restored in 1879. Now something big was going on. There were many things happening in the post-Civil War years. And probably the least of which, in terms of importance, was the deterioration of Shaker cemeteries everywhere. And so, you know, in all the 18 main villages, there were like 25 cemeteries. There were 14 village cemeteries, and 4 of the villages had multiple family cemeteries, and they were all disintegrating. They had individual stone markers, and they were crumbling. So the brothers in Mount Lebanon went to work, and they produced a pattern for a metal tablet, the cost of which was about $1.50 at that time per tablet. Harvard was the only cemetery that completely converted them to metal tablets.
I think that there's always been that problem that we unfortunately were so successful at making material goods that our material goods will be remembered more than we are. But I think that anybody who looks at it, really looks, not just looks at a piece of furniture, but looks at the life itself and anything, they won't think about it. They hopefully will think that these were the people of God, who are just ordinary people trying to live rather extraordinary lives.
Believer's life is the best of any. 'Tis full of comfort, void of strife, well beloved by many. Other joys are foolish toys, no abiding treasure. Only this leads to bliss, pure delight and pleasure. Other joys are foolish toys, no abiding treasure. Only this leads to bliss, pure delight and pleasure.